"You're too small for this, sweetheart. Why don't you go home to mommy?" Those were the words that echoed across Fort Braxton's training ground on that scorching Tuesday morning. But what happened next? What this so-called weak female recruit did in response? It left an entire platoon of cocky male soldiers completely speechless. The voice belonged to Sergeant Marcus Kane, a 6 feet 2 inches wall of muscle and arrogance who'd made a career out of breaking down new recruits. His target? A 5 feet 4 inches woman with auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun, standing perfectly still despite the verbal assault. Her name was Sarah Chun, and she had just become the center of the most humiliating display of toxic masculinity the base had seen in years. But here's the thing nobody knew. Sarah stood there, taking the abuse with a composure that should have been the first warning sign. Her green eyes remained steady, fixed on some point beyond Kane's sneering face. She didn't flinch when he stepped closer, close enough that his spit hit her cheek as he continued his tirade. "Look at those skinny arms. You probably can't even do 10 push-ups." Kane barked, his voice carrying across the training yard where dozens of other recruits had stopped what they were doing to watch the spectacle. Some of the male recruits were snickering, already writing Sarah off as another washout. What they couldn't see was the way Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. What they couldn't know was that beneath her regulation uniform, her body carried scars that told a very different story. Kane grabbed a 50-pound rucksack and slammed it on the ground in front of her. "Since you want to play soldiers so badly, let's see you carry this around the obstacle course. The boys here did it in under 12 minutes. I'm betting you'll tap out before the first wall." The crowd of recruits formed a loose circle, sensing drama. This was entertainment, watching the pretty little girl get put in her place. Even some of the other female recruits looked skeptical. Sarah was small, there was no denying that. In a world where bigger often meant better, she looked out of place. But then Sarah spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. Her voice was quiet but carried perfectly in the still morning air. "What do I get when I beat their time?" Here's what nobody at Fort Braxton knew about Sarah Chun. 3 years earlier, she had been Staff Sergeant Sarah Chun of the 75th Ranger Regiment's Female Engagement Team. She had completed 2 combat deployments in Afghanistan, survived an IED blast that killed 3 of her teammates, and earned a Silver Star for valor that she never talked about. The reason she was here, starting over as a recruit, was because she had volunteered for an experimental cross-training program designed to evaluate integration protocols for special operations. Her mission, to assess training methods while maintaining her cover as an ordinary new soldier. But as she strapped on that 50-pound rucksack, feeling the familiar weight settle against her spine, she wasn't thinking about her mission. She was thinking about Martinez, who died in her arms after that roadside bomb. She was thinking about every person who had ever told her she didn't belong. The obstacle course at Fort Braxton was no joke. It started with a 200-meter sprint to a 12-foot wall, followed by rope climbing, tire runs, crawl under barbed wire, and ended with a grueling hill climb that left even seasoned infantry soldiers gasping. Kane blew his whistle with theatrical flair. "Go ahead, princess. Show us what you've got." Sarah took off. What happened next defied everything the watching soldiers thought they knew about physical capability. Sarah moved like liquid mercury. Her smaller stature, which everyone had seen as a weakness, became her greatest advantage. She hit the first wall at full speed and seemed to simply flow up and over it, barely breaking stride. The watching recruits went quiet. "Did you see that?" whispered Private Johnson to the guy next to him. She didn't even slow down for the wall. But Sarah was just getting started. At the rope climb, instead of struggling like most recruits did, she ascended with a fluid efficiency that spoke of countless hours of conditioning. Her technique was flawless. Legs wrapped, arms pulling in perfect rhythm, breathing controlled. Kane's smug expression was beginning to falter. He checked his stopwatch and frowned. She was already ahead of the fastest male recruit's pace. The tire run came next, a section where recruits had a high step through 20 heavy tires as quickly as possible. This was where smaller soldiers usually lost time, their shorter strides working against them. Sarah attacked it differently. Instead of fighting the tires, she seemed to dance through them, her feet finding the centers with metronomic precision. "Jesus Christ," muttered Corporal Davis, a drill instructor who had been preparing to write Sarah off. "She's not even breathing hard." The low-crawl section was where many recruits scraped themselves bloody, where claustrophobia and exhaustion combined to break spirits. Soldiers had to belly crawl under razor wire for 50 meters, keeping low enough to avoid getting shredded. Sarah dropped to her stomach and disappeared into the wire like she was returning home. Her movements were economical, practiced. She knew exactly how low to stay, exactly how to distribute her weight, exactly how to move without catching the wire. Because she had done this before, under live fire, with real bullets snapping overhead instead of just training wire. As she emerged from the far end, not a scratch on her, Kane's face had gone pale. His stopwatch showed a time that shouldn't have been possible for someone her size. The watching recruits weren't laughing anymore. They were staring in stunned silence at this small woman who was dismantling everything they thought they knew about physical performance. "Holy shit," someone whispered. "She's going to beat the record." The last section was brutal, a steep hill climb with the full weight of the rucksack, designed to destroy leg muscles and crush spirits. This was where even the strongest soldiers faltered, where training records went to die. Sarah attacked the hill like she was angry at it. Her pace didn't slow. If anything, she seemed to accelerate, her legs driving with mechanical precision. The 50-pound pack might as well have been empty. Other soldiers were bent over, gasping, as she passed them going in the opposite direction, having already completed the course. Kane's stopwatch showed 9 minutes and 47 seconds when Sarah crossed the finish line. She had beaten the base record by over 2 minutes. Not just beaten it, obliterated it. But here's the thing that really shook everyone watching. Sarah wasn't even breathing hard. She stood there, barely perspiring, while Kane stared at his stopwatch like it was broken. The circle of recruits who had been expecting to see her fail were now looking at her, like she was some sort of alien. "Ow!" Kane finally managed to croak out. Sarah unshouldered the rucksack and set it down gently. When she spoke, her voice was still quiet, still controlled. "You want to know how?" Sarah looked around at the circle of stunned faces. These young soldiers who had written her off, who had been ready to watch her fail for their entertainment. She saw their confusion, their embarrassment, their dawning realization that they had made a terrible miscalculation. 3 years ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet, I was carrying a wounded teammate through a kill zone in the Hindu Kush Mountains. He weighed 190 pounds. My gear weighed 80 pounds. The altitude was 10,000 feet, and there were people shooting at us. The silence was absolute now. Even Kane seemed to have forgotten how to speak. I carried him for 3 miles, Sarah continued, because that's what you do. You don't leave people behind because they're too heavy. You don't quit because it's hard. You do whatever it takes to complete the mission. She picked up the rucksack again, hefting it like it weighed nothing. This weighs 50 pounds. There's nobody shooting at me. The altitude here is 800 feet, and my teammate's life doesn't depend on my speed. She looked directly at Kane. So no, Sergeant. This wasn't hard. This was just Tuesday morning. Word of what happened spread through Fort Braxton like wildfire. By lunch, everyone knew about the small woman who had destroyed the obstacle course record. But more than that, they knew about the way she had carried herself, the quiet dignity with which she had handled Kane's abuse. Captain Morrison, the company commander, called Kane into his office that afternoon. The conversation was brief and pointed. Sergeant, I just got off the phone with Colonel Stevens at JSOC. Apparently, we have a Medal of Honor recommended soldier training incognito on my base, and she's been subjected to harassment by one of my NCOs. Kane felt the bottom drop out of his world. Sir, I didn't know. That's the point, Sergeant. You didn't know. You saw a small woman and assumed weakness. You saw someone different and decided to make them a target. What does that say about your judgment? Morrison leaned back in his chair. Staff Sergeant Shun is here on special assignment. Her identity was classified for the purposes of this evaluation. But what's not classified is that she has more combat experience than half the soldiers on this base combined. That evening, Kane found Sarah in the chow hall. She was sitting alone, reading a book while she ate. He approached her table, his hat in his hands. Ma'am, could I speak with you for a moment? Sarah looked up from her book. Her expression was neutral, giving nothing away. Of course, Sergeant. Kane sat down across from her, struggling with words he'd never had to say before. I owe you an apology. What I did this morning, it was unprofessional. It was wrong, and it was based on assumptions that I had no right to make. Sarah set down her book and studied him. What assumptions were those? I saw someone small and assumed you were weak. I saw a woman and assumed you couldn't handle the training. I was wrong on both counts. Sarah nodded slowly. Yes, you were. But do you know why you were wrong? Kane thought about it. Because I judged you based on appearance instead of ability? That's part of it, Sarah agreed. But the bigger problem is that you decided someone deserved to be humiliated before you knew anything about them. Size, gender, race, background, none of that should matter when it comes to basic human respect. She leaned forward slightly. I've served with soldiers from every background you can imagine. Big guys, small guys, women, men, people from cities, people from farms. And you know what I learned? The size of someone's heart matters a lot more than the size of their biceps. Kane nodded, genuinely chastened. How do I make this right? Sarah considered the question. You don't make it right with me, Sergeant. You make it right with the next person who walks into your training yard. The next soldier who looks different or seems out of place. Instead of looking for reasons to tear them down, look for ways to build them up. She picked up her book again. And maybe remember that everyone has a story you know nothing about. Over the following weeks, something changed on the training ground at Fort Braxton. Kane's approach to new recruits became more measured, more focused on bringing out potential rather than highlighting weaknesses. The other drill instructors noticed and began adopting similar approaches. Sarah continued her assignment, quietly observing and evaluating. She never used her real rank or background to gain advantage. She completed every training exercise, every evaluation, every challenge as if she really were just another recruit. But her example had changed something fundamental in the culture of the base. Soldiers began to look beyond surface appearances. They began to understand that strength comes in many forms. 3 months into the program, Fort Braxton hosted a multi-base training competition. It was a grueling event that tested everything from marksmanship to endurance to tactical thinking. Each base was allowed to send their top performers. Ken approached Sarah after morning PT. His demeanor was completely different now. Respectful, professional. Chun, I'd like to recommend you for the competition team. Sarah looked up from cleaning her rifle. Based on what criteria, Sergeant? Based on the fact that you're the best soldier on this base, and everyone knows it. She had continued to excel in every metric. Her PT scores were off the charts. Her marksmanship was expert level. Her tactical knowledge during field exercises consistently impressed the evaluators. But more than that, she had become a quiet leader among the recruits. When someone was struggling with a particular skill, they sought out Sarah's help. When morale was low, her steady presence seemed to lift everyone up. She never boasted about her abilities or her background. She just led by example. I appreciate the recommendation, Sergeant, but I think there might be others who could benefit more from the experience. Kane shook his head. Ma'am, with respect, this competition is about representing the base at the highest level. We need our best people out there. Sarah ultimately agreed to compete, and the results were as expected. She dominated the individual events, obstacle course, marksmanship, land navigation, tactical scenarios. But what impressed the observers most was how she elevated the performance of her teammates. During the team events, she never took the spotlight. Instead, she quietly positioned herself where she could best support others. When a teammate struggled with a heavy load, she redistributed weight without being asked. When someone got lost during navigation, she guided them back on course without making them feel incompetent. The Fort Braxton team won the overall competition by the largest margin in the event's history. At the awards ceremony, when Sarah was called up to receive the individual champion trophy, she did something unexpected. She asked Kane to join her on the stage. 3 months ago, she said, speaking to the assembled soldiers from multiple bases, Sergeant Kane and I had what you might call a misunderstanding. He made some assumptions about my capabilities based on my appearance. But instead of letting that moment define our relationship, we both learned from it. She turned to Kane. This sergeant taught me something important about leadership. He showed me that the strongest leaders are the ones who can admit when they're wrong and change their approach accordingly. Kane looked uncomfortable with the praise, but Sarah continued. The real victory here isn't my individual performance. It's what happened to our entire unit when we stopped judging each other based on what we looked like and started focusing on what we could accomplish together. After the competition, Sarah's assignment at Fort Braxton was complete. Her final report would contribute to new training protocols that would be implemented Army-wide. But before she left, there was one more conversation she needed to have. She found Kane in his office, reviewing training schedules for the next cycle of recruits. "Sergeant, I wanted to thank you." Kane looked up, surprised. "Thank me?" "Ma'am, I treated you terribly when you first arrived." "Yes, you did," Sarah agreed. "But then you grew. You changed. And that's not easy for anyone to do, especially not in front of subordinates. It takes real courage to admit you're wrong and change your behavior." She sat down across from his desk. "Can I tell you something? The reason I was really here." Kane nodded. "I'm part of a special evaluation team. My job was to assess how well integrated training programs work, particularly how traditional male-dominated units adapt to female soldiers." "Your initial reaction?" "That was exactly what we expected to find." Kane winced. "I played right into the stereotype." "You did. But what happened next? That's the part that gives me hope. You didn't just double down on your prejudices. You recognized that you'd made a mistake, and you actively worked to correct it. That's not common, and it's incredibly valuable." Sarah stood up to leave. "The report I'm filing is going to recommend Fort Braxton as a model for integration training. Not because you got everything right from the start, but because you demonstrated the ability to learn and improve." 6 months after Sarah left Fort Braxton, Kane received a letter. Inside was a newspaper clipping about a Medal of Honor ceremony at the White House. The photo showed a small woman in dress blues receiving the nation's highest military award for actions during a combat operation in Afghanistan. The woman was Sarah Chun. The citation described how she had single-handedly held off an enemy assault while evacuating wounded teammates, how she had carried 3 soldiers to safety under heavy fire, and how her actions had saved the lives of 12 American soldiers. At the bottom of the clipping, Sarah had written a note. "Thought you might want to know the rest of the story. Thank you for helping me complete my mission. S.C." Kane kept that clipping on his desk. It served as a daily reminder of the lesson he had learned. Never judge a soldier by their appearance. Always look for the potential in everyone, and remember that the strongest people often carry their strength quietly. The training programs at Fort Braxton became a model for bases across the country. Kane was eventually promoted and put in charge of implementing similar protocols at other installations. He never forgot the small woman who had taught him that true strength isn't about size or gender. It's about character, determination, and the willingness to do what's right even when it's difficult. Years later, when Kane was asked about the most important lesson he'd learned as a drill instructor, he would tell the story of Sarah Chun. Not the heroic combat actions that earned her a Medal of Honor, but the quiet dignity with which she had handled his initial mistreatment. "She could have destroyed me," he would say. "She could have revealed her rank and background and made me look like a fool from day one. Instead, she let me learn from my mistakes. She turned a moment of ignorance into a teaching opportunity." That's what real leaders do. The culture change at Fort Braxton rippled outward. Soldiers who trained there carried new attitudes to their next assignments. They looked beyond stereotypes, gave people chances to prove themselves, and understood that diversity of backgrounds and experiences made units stronger, not weaker. Sarah's example showed that you don't need to be the loudest person in the room to be a leader. You don't need to broadcast your achievements to earn respect. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply perform with excellence and treat others with dignity, regardless of how they treat you. The story of Sarah Chun reminds us that assumptions are dangerous things. They blind us to potential. They limit our understanding of others, and they prevent us from seeing the extraordinary capabilities that often hide behind ordinary appearances. In a world that often judges quickly and harshly, Sarah chose a different path. She let her actions speak louder than her words. She turned a moment of disrespect into an opportunity for growth, both for herself and for others. Her legacy at Fort Braxton wasn't just about breaking records or proving doubters wrong. It was about showing that true strength comes from character, that real leadership is about lifting others up, and that the measure of a person isn't found in their size or gender, but in their heart and their determination to do what's right. The next time you see someone who looks different, who seems out of place, who doesn't fit your expectations, remember Sarah Chun. Remember that everyone has a story you know nothing about. Remember that the person you're tempted to underestimate might just be the one who ends up saving your life. Because in the end, we're all stronger when we stop seeing what divides us and start recognizing what makes each of us valuable. That's the lesson Sarah taught, and it's one that Fort Braxton and everyone who heard her story will never forget. Asterisk if this story of quiet strength and dignity in the face of adversity moved you. Remember to like this video and subscribe for more stories of unsung heroes who changed the world one person at a time. And the next time you meet someone new, ask yourself, what assumptions am I making and what might I be missing about this person's story?